by SBL and AR in conjunction with SCS Press, which is local here at El Cajon. Myself, I am Dr. Cory Marsh. I am professor of New Testament at Southern California Seminary, which is about 15 minutes down the road, as I just mentioned. I also direct our THM program there and help direct our publishing arm. And last year, we had published a book at the table in the back called Discovering Dispensationalism, subtitle. Of course, in academic books, the thesis is always the subtitle, right? The subtitle, Tracing Dispensational Thought, Tracing the Development of Dispensational Thought. Here, let me look at my books. Tracing the Development of Dispensational Thought from the 1st to the 21st century. And we are grateful for the success that it had and continues to have. Those who are not familiar with dispensationalism or dispensational thought, as we say in our subtitle, that is dispensational ideas, themes, beliefs, patterns, things that would later find a home, what we call dispensationalism. We're very thankful that there has been a resurgence of interest in specifically the historical development of dispensational thought. So at the same time, providentially, about the same time when we published our book, Dr. Dan Hummel had his book published by Erdman's, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. That subtitle, if I can remember, is how end times shape nature evangelical, but I'm butchering it. I can't get the subtitle right now. We all know the red cover and its rise and fall of dispensationalism. Anyways, it came out about the same time, which has helped spark, I think, a conversation that needs to be happening on where is dispensationalism now? Has it fallen? What versions of dispensationalism are we talking about? Popular level or academic level, or as in Dan's book, scholastic dispensationalism? What is the current milieu of dispensational thought? Our two books aren't the only ones that have come out recently on this very thing. Tim Perry published in Bright Irwin After Dispensationalism. Don Atkinson has published the Americanization Apocalypse. I think that's what it's called. Also on these ideas. Crawford Gribben just published a book on John Nelson Darby that's doing very well with Oxford University Press. The point is, and this room shows it too with you guys being here, the interest that you have is being shared outside these walls of the interest of dispensationalism. What is it? What makes it up? How did it develop? Is it something to be discarded? We've all seen the popular level stuff, whether it's Left Behind novels or the Rapture Ready clock, or you name it. There's other video games and other things about dispensationalism because it kind of lends itself to an eschatology that makes for good movies, quite simply. But that is also because it's based on a consistent literal interpretation, so the dispensationalists would say. It doesn't take a PhD to be able to understand the Bible. If you read it plainly, you're going to come to these ideas that Hollywood likes to grab onto and sort of exploit, I would say. However, we should be returning to this conversation of dispensational thought, especially in the academy. I think we all would agree here dispensationalism is something that was birthed as a local church movement based on a plain reading of the text, but that doesn't mean that it has nothing to contribute in academia. A little context for today, for 2 years now, we had proposed a session with ETS around these same ideas we're talking about right now, and it hasn't worked out. This year, SBL AR decided to sponsor it, which was a pleasant surprise for us. But of course, adding to my constant whine of the bias against dispensationalism, they want to put us in the most inconvenient room possible, hoping that you guys wouldn't actually find where we're at, right? But you did find it. You're here. And it's a testimony to the interest in academic dispensational thought. So let me just give a rundown of what to expect for the next 2 hours. I am your moderator. I'm going to speak just a couple more minutes. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. James Fazio, who I'll introduce in just a moment before he gets up. He's going to give a 30-minute presentation of a paper that is going to eventually lead to a response by Dr. Dan Hummel. We're going to end on Dan's closing remarks responding to the paper, but in between that, we're also going to have a panel discussion here. Everybody you see on the table right here were contributors to that book, Discovering Dispensationalism, which myself and James edited. We couldn't have all our authors here, but there's a few of you actually in the crowd as well. But there are certain questions that will be raised from James's paper, as well as some that have been submitted online. We plan to have a microphone right here, and even up here on the table. It didn't work out, so we're gonna have to project our voice. But if there is time, and hopefully there will be, if you have any questions you want to ask our panel when we get to that, which I will be moderating, please stand up and put on your Charles Spurgeon voice and just yell it out so everybody can hear that particular question. Hopefully we'll have time for that. But as I mentioned, after the panel discussion, Dr. Hummel is going to come up and give a critical response, and we're going to end basically on those remarks. More technically, I will come back up and close our session out, and we'll be done by 2:30. So that being said, I do want to just mention one more thing, is that our book, Discovering Dispensationalism, we do have copies in the back for those of you who haven't gotten one. We have it at 30% off, I believe, right now, so it's $21 back in the back. And we also have a booth in the exhibit hall, which many of you have seen already at ETS. You can buy them there, as well as some other books that we publish. We are big on publishing conservative biblical theological works from an academic scholarly perspective. And by God's grace, we actually have some works that are finding their way to hands and to hearers and readers who normally wouldn't get our works. We're very thankful for that. So if you don't pick up a book here in the back, we do have a booth over at ETS, and you can there. Okay, so we're going to start with our paper presentation by Dr. James Fazio. We're going to go about 30 minutes from 12:45 he has till 1:15, give or take a few minutes. And let me introduce James. He is the academic dean and professor of biblical studies at Southern California Seminary. Dr. Fazio is the author of 2 commissions, 2 missionary mandates in Matthew's Gospel. He is also the co-editor of Forged from Reformation, How Dispensational Thought Advances the Reformed Legacy, published in 2017 at the 500th anniversary of the process of Reformation. He's also a co-editor with me on Discovering Dispensationalism, tracing the development of dispensational thought from the 1st to 21st century, this very book right here. In addition to contributing to studies in Brethren history, the Brethren and the Church in 2020, James has published articles in multiple theological journals. Dr. Fazio received his PhD in history from Queen's University, Belfast, under the supervision of Crawford Gribben, with a dissertation focused on the ecclesiology of John Nelson Darby. A monograph version right now is under review with T&T Clark, I believe, tentatively titled J. and Darby, Dispensationalism and the Ruin of the Church. Did I get that right? Excellent. Well, if you will, with me, please welcome our speaker, Dr. James Fazio.
Okay. So I'm going to be reading a paper called Reevaluating the Influence of John Nelson Darby on Dispensationalism from Past to Present. You should have all received one when you came in the door. So if not, we have one for you. But I'm going to begin reading that now. Of particular value, I will not be reading the footnotes, but there's a lot there that I would recommend you take a look at. An introduction. Pastors, theologians, and church historians possessing even a vague familiarity with dispensationalism have been introduced to the name John Nelson Darby. The 19th century Anglo-Irish churchman has been widely touted as the intellectual architect behind the dispensational system of theology that became popularized in the 20th century through the influence of others such as C.I. Scofield and Louis Berry Chafer. This narrative has remained largely unchallenged by both critics and proponents of dispensationalism. In the next 30 minutes, I will argue against the popular claim that dispensational thought was a theological innovation originated in the mind of John Nelson Darby around 1830. Moreover, I maintain that the dispensational framework that Darby advocated had less of an impact on the way dispensationalists after him came to understand God's successive dealings with mankind than many have acknowledged. I would add to this that some dispensational arrangements conceived by theologians living in the 17th and 18th centuries reflect greater parity with Scofield's, Chafer's, and the generations of dispensationalists who followed in their tradition than with John Nelson Darby's. While Darby's robust exegetical work most notably in Daniel and Revelation, helped dispensational eschatology secure a foothold in the 20th century evangelical consciousness. The notion that Darby was the mastermind behind such ideas as the rapture of the church, preceding the activity of the Antichrist, God's differing programs with his distinct earthly and heavenly peoples, and the dispensational framework as a way of understanding the biblical narrative is quite simply false. Now, you've heard it said, if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. You will even come to believe it yourself. Although this quote from the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels carries a nefarious connotation, it remains no less true if the falsehood is unwittingly repeated. Over the past decade, you've probably heard sincere, yet misinformed pastors, theologians, or church historians repeat the idea that Darby invented the idea of the pre-tribulational rapture of the church and concocted the dispensational system of theology. Perhaps you've seen William Lane Craig's critique of James Darby in a YouTube video that has made its rounds on social media. Or you may have caught Pastor Joel Webbin decrying a Joseph Darby on the Orrin McIntyre podcast. Or you could have heard country musician John Rich on Tucker Carlson's national platform asserting that John Nelson Darby was conspiratorially linked to the Rothschild family. At least the entertainer got his name right. To anyone paying attention, it would seem that being uninformed and having something negative to say about dispensationalism is all the qualification one needs to dish out misinformation on Darby. Unfortunately, pastors with a predilection to reject dispensational theology are particularly susceptible to repeating these false claims. All of this has contributed to the phenomenon described above, known as the illusory truth effect, as it concerns Darby's responsibility as creative genius behind the division of history into 7 dispensations. The trouble is, Darby never advocated the 7-fold dispensational scheme presented in the Scofield Reference Bible. If that's not enough, the point can be further pressed that theologians who lived centuries before Darby did lay out a dispensational framework for history that closely resembles Scofield's septarian arrangement. The unfortunate fact is that dispensational mischaracterization extends beyond social media segments and YouTube programming. In a new title released just last year by Lexham Press, John Nelson Darby is unreservedly touted as, quote, the founder of dispensationalism, whose division of world history into dispensations, economies, or ages, in which God in various ways has reached out to humanity, erected the theological scaffolding for the 7-fold approach popularized by C.I. Scofield. In a second title, also released last year, historian Daniel Hummel unequivocally asserted, the story of dispensationalism invariably begins with Darby and his teachings. Meanwhile, in a third title, published last year by Oxford University Press, another historian ascribed to Darby an arrangement of history that consisted of 7 successive dispensations, despite the fact that at no time in Darby's extended and diverse literary career did he ever articulate a septarian dispensational scheme. This same mistake, resulting from an anachronistic reading of Darby, was repeated by another Darby scholar in a title published by Oxford University Press just earlier this year. It seems the attention given by first-rate scholars and world-class publishing houses has not yet corrected the centuries-long problem of misreading Darby and perpetuating dispensational misunderstanding. However, it should be acknowledged that modest advancements have been made in recent years. Daniel Hummel has rightly asserted that the concept of dispensations, or divisions of time, was not new to Christian thought, and that Darby was not making entirely novel contributions when he was constructing his dispensational arrangement of history. While this point has been noted by several historians over the past few decades, It is good to see it acknowledged by historians with university appointments. Crawford Gribben further affirmed that Darby's interventions were not always innovations. As some of his critics noticed, many of the ideas to which he gave voice had been proposed among the hotter sort of Protestants in the mid-17th century. Moreover, the publication of Discovering Dispensationalism last year did its small part in moving the needle to the extent that distinguished historian David Bevington acknowledged that elements of later dispensational teaching occurred in nearly every period before J.N. Darby. Even detractors have begun to change their tune. For instance, Donald Harmon Akinson, who in 2016 cited Darby as the architect of the dispensational arrangement of history into 7 successive ages that others would go on to emulate, he has come around to acknowledge that Schofield's concept of the biblical covenants and dispensations, quote, is very unlike anything that John Nelson Darby would have proposed. In fact, just last year, Akinson admitted that Scofield did not get his septarian dispensational scheme from Darby or from any English theologian, for that matter. He posited that Scofield may have rather been influenced by the Southern Baptist minister James Robinson Graves, whose book, The Work of Christ and the Covenant of Redemption, developed in 7 dispensations, Akinson believes may have served to influence the Scofield Reference Bible. All of this raises the question of the extent to which Darby's ideas influenced contemporary dispensational thought, as it is widely conceived today. The tendency to view history arranged according to biblically discernible successive eras stretches back to the earliest years of the church. This is evidenced in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers, whether Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, successive dispensational schemes, both of which numbered 4, or the popular septarian millennial day-age structure that superimposed the days of creation week over all of human history, as referenced in the Epistle of Barnabas. The septarian millennial age theory, which became rather popular in the 2nd century, maintained 2 distinct features. Through an abstraction of 2 Peter 3:8, which states that with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. First was the expectation that the Lord will finish all things in 6,000 years. And second, that when his Son, coming again, shall destroy the time of the wicked man and judge the ungodly and change the sun and the moon and the stars, then shall he truly rest on the 7th day. According to this theory, biblical history consisted of 7 discernible epochs, the 7th of which would be the 1,000-year reign of Christ's kingdom upon the earth. So pronounced was this expectation of a future millennial reign of Christ among the earliest Christians that Presbyterian historian Philip Schaff noted, quote, belief of a visible reign of Christ in glory on earth with the risen saints for 1,000 years before the general resurrection and judgment was the most striking point in the eschatology of the ante-Nicene age. Michael Spiegel's recent title, The Fathers on the Future, is a valuable resource that offers a wealth of evidence in support of this. In addition to these premillennial expectations, the early church fathers held a range of positions concerning the future activity of Antichrist upon the earth. Some were rather explicit that it would be a period of 7 years, divided into 2 3.5-year periods, or 42 months. Irenaeus, in particular, specified that Christ's reign in Jerusalem would come after the appearance of the Antichrist, as anticipated in 2 Thessalonians, which he corresponded to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy and the 7-year tribulation, in the middle of which time, this is his words, quote, the abomination of desolation shall be brought into the temple. Moreover, he maintained that preceding this tribulation, the church would be suddenly caught up to be with Christ, saying, and therefore, when in the end the church shall be suddenly caught up from this, it is said, there shall be tribulation such as has not been since the beginning, neither shall be. While such views did not become the majority position of the church in the centuries that followed, it is irresponsible, if not disingenuous, to carry on as if these ideas have not been present since the earliest centuries of the church. Why is it then? The narrative has been repeated that John Nelson Darby first put forward these ideas in the 19th century. I maintain that there are several reasons for this, at least two of which are particularly advantageous for dispensationalism's critics. Number one, it argues that the ideas associated with dispensational thought are a modern invention. And two, it sets up a convenient guilt by association argument for those with an interest in viewing Darby as a contemporary of Joseph Smith, Mary Baker Eddy, and Charles Taze Russell. This ignores the fact that Darby is no less a contemporary of J.C. Ryle, Charles Spurgeon, and B.B. Warfield. However, the selective grouping has proved a valuable device for dispensationalism's critics. The fact that Darby may not be the originator of dispensationalism's distinct features does not mean that his contribution to dispensational thought is inconsequential. Darby made significant advancements for dispensational theology in the 19th century. Through his classical training and engagement with the patristic fathers, his diligent study of the Hebrew prophets, and his careful exegesis of the Greek Testament, Darby supplied an emerging, biblically literate, and apocalyptically concerned evangelical population all the essential tools for a dispensational renaissance. However, it was Scofield's inclusion of dispensational commentary in the study Bible that became the go-to source for evangelical preachers and churchgoers across North America that may have made the biggest impact on the dispensational consciousness of lay theologians. Nevertheless, the dispensational commentary included in that Bible and reflected elsewhere in his writings does not bear those distinct characteristics which Darby came to associate with his understanding of the historical dispensations. Larry Crutchfield has strongly asserted, if there is one assertion that begs refutation, it is that Scofield and those who followed him borrowed wholesale jot and tittle from Darby. Though it cannot be denied that both men were occupied with similar thoughts concerning the nature of the church and its relationship to Israel in the coming dispensation, it seems far more likely that both men were drawing from a similar pool. Or as Crutchfield has illustratively put it, if Scofield robbed Darby's treasuries, he took his dispensational diadem and melted it down and cast it as something quite different from the original. Mangum and Sweetnam have come out and cited Scofield's dispensational arrangement as an original contribution and an area where he was happy to deviate from Darby. However commendable their acknowledgement of the disparity between these two dispensational schemes may be, they go too far to laud Scofield for the originality in his dispensational arrangement. In his classical work on dispensationalism, Charles Ryrie noted that Scofield's dispensational arrangement parroted that of Isaac Watts more than it did Darby's. Moreover, Ryrie affirmed that Darby's teachings was obviously not the pattern Scofield followed. If Scofield parroted anybody's scheme, it was Watts, not Darby's. Scott Aniol has compared Scofield's dispensational scheme to that of Isaac Watts, and has rightly concluded that, like the dispensationalist, Watts sees progressive stages in the outworking of God's plan in the world. But Watts understands that plan much differently than the dispensationalist. His different understanding stems from the fact that Watts did not fully embrace a distinct future dispensation of the fullness of times, a feature which serves an indispensable role in dispensational premillennialism. Without the concept of the coming kingdom, Watts' dispensational arrangement of history cannot properly be considered the forerunner for American dispensationalism. Even the postmillennialism of Richard Graves accounted for the future restoration of Israel in the dispensation of the fullness of times, though it did not account for a sevenfold arrangement of God's previous dealings with man, arranged according to economies or administrations. However, The successive arrangement of the dispensations presented in 1687 by Pierre Poirenaud's Économie divine, in 1699 by John Edwards, A Complete History or Survey of All the Dispensations, or in 1728 by John Barrington Schutz, An Essay on the Several Dispensations of God, may be seen to parallel Scofield's successive dispensations a bit more closely. Specifically, Poiret corresponded the passage of divine epochal periods to the development of humanity through phases of adulthood, from infancy to childhood, adolescence, and old age. It may well be Poiret's arrangement of redemptive history into 7 dispensations, culminating in a glorious, restored, future millennial kingdom that bears the closest resemblance to Scofield's. In Discovering Dispensationalism, I presented my argument for how Darby's understanding of the dispensations was informed by the classic Greek concept of oikonomia, expressed by Xenophon, the Greek philosopher. This idea carried with it the accompanying features of responsibility, testing, and judgment, which feature prominently in Darby's concept of the dispensations, the traces of which can also be found in Scofield's presentation of the dispensations. The very arrangement of biblical history into dispensations has this idea embedded into it, as noted by so many other dispensational thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries. The ancient Greek concept of dispensations includes the idea of the administration of household affairs, with the accompanying feature of judgment based on accountability. Darby spoke to this point, saying, every dispensation has some special deposit, so to speak, entrusted to it, by which its fidelity is tried. And as it seems to me, every one of them will be made good, and God glorified in them, in Jesus, on the proved failure of man in each. Darby believed that God would be glorified through Christ in every dispensation upon the occasion of man's failure to meet God's holy standard. Like the host of dispensational thinkers which preceded him, Scofield also included concepts of testing and judgment in his arrangement of dispensations. Scofield would even define a dispensation as, quote, a period of time during which man is tested in respect to some specific revelation of the will of God. 7 such dispensations are distinguished in Scripture. Thus, Scofield defined the dispensations with respect to responsibility, testing, and judgment, and saw each of these features as integral to his dispensational arrangement. Despite these similarities, Scofield and Darby perceived of the dispensations quite differently. Scofield's concept of testing and judgment within the dispensations only superficially paralleled Darby's. Scofield suggested that each dispensation ended in failure as the protracted outcome of the test by which God proved mankind. In the case of the church, this would eventually become manifest as world affairs grow more wicked, few will accept Christ, thus provoking God to judge the earth in the Great Tribulation. This idea stands apart from Darby's concept of the ruin of the church, which he articulated in 1840, pronouncing the ruin as he found it in the church, saying, the dispensation is in ruins and in a condition of entire departure from its original standing. For Darby, each dispensation was marked by failure from the outset. Ruin was an ever-present condition, which marked the present dispensation, whereas apostasy would mark God's judgment at the end of the dispensation. For Darby, ruin and apostasy were 2 distinguishable features in each dispensation. The former, ruin, being the manifestation of an evil disposition toward God, and the latter, apostasy, being the manifestation of God's judgment. The present dispensation would persist in its ruinous state until the judgment of God at last befalls the church. Though it might further be noted that by the time Darby fully constructed his framework for the dispensations, he determined that the church, in fact, did not meet the criteria for dispensation. Thus, he came to regard the church as a parenthesis or interlude embedded within a dispensation, rather than a dispensation unto itself. Darby perceived of the church as a parenthesis, not merely amidst God's dealing with Israel, but within the dispensation of the Gentiles. This serves to further distinguish Darby's dispensationalism from Scofield's, as well as from other dispensational thinkers which preceded him. Darby regarded God's program with the Gentiles, that began with Babylon, as depicted by Nebuchadnezzar's image, as a parenthetical dispensation within God's dealing with Israel. Thus, it can be said that Darby conceived of concentric dispensations, or one could otherwise say that Darby regarded dispensations within dispensations. He was not so clear as to use that kind of language explicitly. Nevertheless, the implications are evident. The Jewish dispensation, which was marked by ruin from the outset with the worship of the golden calf, Darby perceived as temporarily set aside, and though it persisted in a state of ruin for centuries, its conclusive judgment lies ahead in the 7-year tribulation, which he called the time of Jacob's troubles. This very same eschatological event would also mark God's judgment upon the Gentiles. Thus, the 7-year tribulation would serve as the conclusive act whereby God would resume his judgment upon both the Jewish and Gentile dispensations. Anyone familiar with Scofield's, Schaeffer's, or Ryber's sevenfold scheme of successive dispensations would not find Darby's dispensational framework very familiar. For Darby, the dispensations began with Noah, rather than with Adam. Moreover, Darby did not understand the dispensation of Noah to have ceased with the calling of Abraham, saying, "But although the circumstances were thus altered, the principle of government remained untouched." The basis of God's dealing with man on the basis of government was still in effect. However, that rule of life has failed to produce in mankind that which God was after. Therefore, leaving the dispensation of government in effect for all of mankind, God introduced a new principle upon which to deal with a derivative of mankind, a called out people, even a nation. However, in Darby's estimation, Abraham's dispensation was marred by failure from the onset, as evidenced by his descent in Egypt, rather than pressing into the land God had promised him. Thus, God provided a new dispensation with a new governing rule of life, as well as a new calling. This calling did not supplant God's calling of Abraham, neither did it supplant the government God had established through Noah, though there was a new prevailing principle in God's giving of the Mosaic law to the nation of Israel. According to Darby, in Noah and Abraham, we have them distinct. Government in the one, calling in the other. In the Jews, the two things were united, namely, the calling of God and the government upon the earth. Thus, again, it should be apparent that Darby perceived of concentric dispensations rather than the classical dispensational model of successive dispensations. Therefore, if one were to look for an antecedent to the classical dispensational framework of 7 successive dispensations, one would not find it in the writings of John Nelson Darby. Perhaps the acclaimed Irish historian Donald Atkinson was correct to suggest that Scofield was instead influenced by the Southern Baptist minister James Robinson Graves. However, if one looks back centuries earlier at the writings of 17th and 18th century proto-dispensationalists, such as the French philosopher Pierre Poiré-Naud, the English divine John Edwards, the nonconformist minister and famous hymn writer Isaac Watts, and the English dissenter, 1st Viscount John Shute Barrington, one would find dispensational arrangements that are quite similar to Scofield's, Schaeffer's, and those dispensational theologians who followed in the tradition commonly known today as dispensationalism. In conclusion, since the earliest years of the church, the arrangement of history into 7 distinct epochs, culminating in a literal 1,000-year rule of Christ upon the earth, can be clearly seen in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. Moreover, the early church's eschatological anticipations of a future rapture of the church preceding the activity of the Antichrist is equally discernible in early Christian writings. Even Darby's parsing out of the 3.5 years referenced in both Daniel's prophecy and John's apocalypse can be traced back to the earliest years of the church. It may well be that because Darby was a diligent student of the patristic writers, he came to see some of these features as they did. However, a careful reading of Darby's dispensational theology against his dispensationally minded 17th and 18th century predecessors yields evidence that conflicts with the narrative that pits Darby as the mastermind behind the dispensational arrangement of history. While he most certainly has an important place within the stream of dispensational thought, he should by no means be regarded as the progenitor of a new and emerging theological movement. The fact that critical scholars are beginning to acknowledge these truths offers a glimmer of hope that in the coming years, the cacophony of voices on social media and other popular outlets will also come around, and that the false claim that John Nelson Darby is the intellectual architect behind dispensational thought will soon be left behind. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fazio, for that paper. We're doing pretty good on time, so I want to be able to extend the panel discussion maybe to 50 minutes if we can do it. I have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to ask the panel, and hopefully each one of you will be able a chance to talk. You are scholars, professors, published authors who always have a hard time not knowing when to stop. I'm going to do my best to be able to, that was a joke, by the way. I'm going to do my best to be able to tell you when to wrap it up, to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. If anybody has a question that wants to ask, I'm going to open the floor. After a few questions, you're going to have to just shout it out, like I mentioned earlier. The microphones didn't come in time for this to be able to happen, but I want to start off with introducing our panel for this discussion, which is going to take us to about 2:05. And we've already been introduced to James Fazio. To his right is Dr. Darrell Bock, who is the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement and Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. A New York Times best-selling author and recognized Humboldt scholar from Tübingen University in Germany, Dr. Bock is the author of over 40 books, including Progressive Dispensationalism, co-authored with Craig Blazing in 2000, a Theology of Luke and Acts in 2012, as well as a contributing author to our book, Discovering Dispensationalism, Tracing the Development of Dispensational Thought from the 1st to the 21st Century in 2023. A former president of the Evangelical Theological Society in 2000 to 2001, Darrell has served as a consulting editor for Christianity Today and currently serves on the boards of Wheaton College and Chosen People Ministries. Would you please welcome Dr. Darrell Bock. To his right is Dr. Mark Snoeberger, who is professor of systematic theology and apologetics at Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. He also serves as assistant editor of the Detroit Baptist Seminary Journal, in addition to contributing chapters to Covenantal and Dispensational Theologies, 4 Views on the Continuity of Scripture in 2022 by IVP. He's also a contributing editor to Discovering Dispensationalism, which we published in 2023, and Originalism in Theology and Law. Technical difficulty here. Theology and Law, Comparing Perspectives on the Bible and the Constitution in 2024. Mark has published several scholarly articles in multiple theological journals. Most recently, Dr. Snoeberger is the co-author of 40 Questions About Dispensationalism to be published by Krugerville Academic, along with myself. Would you please welcome Dr. Mark Snoeberger. And finally, to the right, Dr. Phillip Long is professor of Bible and Ministry at Grace Christian University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He also serves as editor of the Journal of Grace Theology, in addition to publishing articles and book reviews for multiple theological journals. Phil is the author of The Book of Enoch for Beginners, an introductory guide to enhance your understanding of the biblical world in 2022. He also published commentary on Galatians, Freedom Through God's Grace in 2019, and Jesus the Bridegroom in 2012. Dr. Long is a contributing editor to our book, Discovering Dispensationalism, which was published again in 2023, and routinely blogs at Reading Acts. Would you please welcome Dr. Phil. Okay, I have a couple questions that I'm going to start off with, and before we open up to any of you that might want to ask something, I want to begin by asking each one of you, and I'm going to direct this, Darrell, to you, Dr. Bock, to briefly comment on the narrative that was just challenged in James's paper, something that we also challenged in our book, Discovering Dispensationalism. That is that dispensationalism is novel or recent or originated in Darby. Darrell, why does this misconception continue to be promulgated despite what seems to be all the evidence to the contrary?
Well, very specific question. I think that this actually fits into something that's been a part of the conversation with dispensationalism going back to the time before I was even a student studying theology. Its roots are reflected even in a book like Dispensationalism Today by Charles Ryrie, who was dealing with the current understanding in his time, so it's called Dispensationalism Today, of dispensation versus some of the things that were being written about dispensations there. So there seems to be an extant pattern of writing on dispensationalism in such a way that it is not fully represented for where it actually is, or I think probably the way to say this today is, or for the variations that exist even within dispensationalism. And in the singular caricature, particularly in doing it in a popularizing kind of way, which is the way many people do get exposed to dispensation, I think it's totally fair to have that conversation. It misses what is going on with dispensationalism as a whole, and oftentimes misrepresents dispensationalism as being, for example, a theological system that is almost exclusively focused on the future. Much of what we've done in progressive dispensationalism is to say that's not the case. In fact, the joke that I make about myself is if the perception of dispensationalism that's out there that has to do primarily, almost exclusively with the future is true, I should not have my job at Dallas Theological Seminary as Director of Cultural Engagement. What am I doing engaging with the culture that is theoretically dispensationalists are not supposed to be engaging with? I'll let you contemplate that in your spare time. And so, I think it's part of a problem, but I think what creates that problem is not doing things like we're doing right now, which is to have conversations between people of different traditions who sit down and have conversations about, okay, so where are you really? And what's really going on here? So I think that's valuable. One of the things I appreciate about the paper is I think it shows the roots, the historical roots of dispensationalism. That's not an innovation that's recent in theological study, but that it reflects conversations that actually were going on in some of the earliest years of the history of the church. So much so that Eusebius was complaining about its presence when he was writing. So I think that's significant. And now I'll be schizophrenic. And that is, in the end, the roots question is interesting, but it's not the most important question. The most important question is, what does the Bible actually teach about dispensations? And how does it actually work? And what is it structured, etc.? So my hope and prayer would be we could get this roots discussion sorted out nicely and clearly so we can have the discussion that really needs to be had between the traditions, and that is, what is the relationship between dispensations and covenants? What is the relationship in the program of God? What is the place in the program of Israel? What does the kingdom actually look like? Is there an ethical core that runs through the whole Bible, or do we chop it up? Those kinds of questions. But you have your set of questions. Those are the ones I have.
That's very good, and I'm glad to hear your schizophrenia actually made sense, because you were worrying about that yesterday. Absolutely. I think the roots of dispensationalism are important, but perhaps maybe not the most important. So it's good to go have a conversation like this. I'm gonna pass it to you guys on the corner, Dr. Snoeberger, Dr. Long as well, if you want to comment on that. why do you think, or do you agree with Darrell, or maybe a fresh idea, why do you think this misconception, or is it even a misconception, that dispensationalism is recent, novel, cultic, it originated in Darby? Why does that continue to be part of it? Mark, go ahead.
Well, again, I'll echo what Darrell just said here. I wish this wasn't the central question, because honestly, even when I started writing this book, I was thinking as I wrote this, this is not really what I want to do here, is to defend that we're older than some people think we are. I mean, it'd be nice to have a little bit more of a pedigree, but at the same time, whether we have a pedigree or not is somewhat irrelevant. But of course, to some, the pedigree is very, very important, and we don't have as much of the pedigree. In fact, it seems that part of the reason that we tend to flourish as dispensationalists when the creed-heavy denominations sort of relax their grip, and those are the ones that have pedigree. And so we're often. In fact, I was just reading about the Fifth Monarchy. I was thinking this is something of an interesting prequel to your book here, because back in the 17th century, there's a lot of particularly among the Puritans, the idea of a restoration of Israel to the land, a mass conversion, even a national Israel, but it sort of fizzled. And Lewis suggests that the biggest reason was because of the Fifth Monarchy. That Fifth Monarchy, radical Reformationism, and then also some just evangelicalism and its sort of laxity, theological laxity, and it became something of a popular movement suddenly. And when the Fifth Monarchy failed, everybody sort of ran away from it. So it seemed like a very interesting prequel to what goes on here. Now that we've had this popular explosion that took place 70s, 80s, 90s, now we're sort of recoiling from that, and I think you're right. At least in terms of our academic contribution, we are in decline. There's no question about that, and it seems like that's happened before.
Well, okay, I'm gonna stop right there. You're jumping ahead. I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
Come back to you. When we put Dan in the hot seat. Phil, any comments to add? Maybe we should be owning that dispensationalism is recent and not be defending it tooth and nail that it's not. I mean, in our book, as you know, we're defending the development of dispensational thought, so ideas and themes and beliefs, not the system being ancient. Is that even a battle worth fighting? What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I think I'll agree with everybody that I wish we were doing something else, and I don't know why all these people are here and why did we publish this book, it's just like, kind of funny. And my reason for that is whenever I read somebody who has a strange idea, they go back into church history and try to find somebody who has that strange idea to sort of support themselves. So when I read things like the book I contributed to, I kind of have that sense of, am I protesting too much here, and I do kind of hesitate, especially with pre-tribulational rapture in some 13th century monk. I don't really want to be associated with that man. He's got some weird ideas to go beyond what I really want to be associated with. So there's a certain hesitancy there to do this. I think it needs to be done, but it shouldn't be the main project. I think things like defining dispensation and those sorts of things, that needs to be going on continually. We just didn't get to, Schofield and, okay, that's perfect. Oh, we get to Ryrie, oh, that's perfect. We got to keep redefining and clarifying what we mean by dispensations, covenants, but general sense.
Fair enough. So this session, both our books with ours and Dan Hummel's is historical. Both are historical books. So the question, I think maybe the main question, at least centered in our argument as well as Dan's, is how this developed. What is the historical veracity, if there is any, of this idea that we call dispensationalism? But apart from that idea, what are the actual doctrines? What are the kingdom of God theme? How important is the rapture? These types of ideas are certainly a conversation to have. And defining dispensations, as you said, to have in the future. I want to make my way back, Mark. I want to make my way back to you. Names apart from Darby were brought up in James's paper as being more aligned with later dispensational thinkers like Schofield, Brooks, Schaeffer, and so on, but usually don't get the focus in criticisms saying that dispensationalism is recent. One earlier scholar that James focused on, he mentioned John Shute Barrington's work, an essay on the several dispensations of God, published in 1728, almost 75 years or so before Darby was born, who held to successive dispensations. In Discovering Dispensationalism, you wrote the chapter on what we call pre-Darby thinkers, from 1600 to 1800, when John L. Darby was born in 1800. What are your thoughts, Mark, on the connection that James made between Barrington's view and more modern conceptions of dispensationalism? Basically, why does this pre-Darby thinker and others that you've researched and found surrounding him who reflect dispensational thought, why don't they appear in most critical works on dispensationalism?
Well, in my chapter, I actually tried to avoid that topic, the number and definitions of dispensations, because it seemed to me to be ancillary to what dispensationalism is. I mean, it's a piece of it. And so I tried to focus more on really Zionism, seeing differences between Israel and the church and such, because that seemed to be more central. But you've got the same thing. You've got I think particularly among the Puritans, you've just got a raft of Puritans who are trying to do missions for Israel because they are convinced from the scriptures. Broughton, with his study of Daniel, a lot of focus on Romans 11:26, that there is going to have to be a mass conversion of Jews and even a regathering into their land as necessary to the end. Now, but a lot of these were post-millennial, so they're trying to do it before Christ comes back. So there are obviously differences here. At the same time, this was a huge emphasis particularly among the Puritans. There are some premillennialists. Joseph Mead, Johann Alstad come to mind as premillennial Puritans. These are some of the guys that end up trying to support Cromwell to sort of establish the fifth monarchy, which is supposed to last 1,000 years. I mean, that was the first 1,000-year reich there that they were, and of course that failed spectacularly, and so most of the Puritans now back away from that, and so they're either going amillennial or post-millennial, but premillennialism sort of fades away. But it's all documented. Peter Toon, Ian Murray both have books on the hope, the Puritan hope attached to the reestablishment of Israel.
So is there a conspiracy theory? Is there a bias that we cannot get these proto-dispensational thinkers any light of day? People don't want to know about them?
I don't like identifying conspiracies, but at the same time, there probably is an interest among the Reformed to suppress some of this. I don't know if it's like concentrated or a conspiratorial kind of thing, but I do think that some of that does happen. In fact, one of the things I just stumbled on this morning is a statement that is made by a professor out in McGill University, but he writes it in a Brill title, that before Calvin's commentary on Romans, there was not another commentary that completely eliminated ethnic Israel from consideration and interpretation. That he was the first. And I can't prove that, so it was an interesting comment in a very scholarly source, and it does seem like this desire to suppress Israel and expunge this Zionist impulse from the history is something that is intentional.
On that note, so Darrell, I want to ask you, because you've published a lot of work, you've done a lot of work in Zionism and the future of Israel, mass salvation of Jews, as well as a national restoration. These are ideas that are part and parcel of what we call dispensationalism, but dispensationalism doesn't own those ideas. What can you say to is there anything that comes to mind of scholarly contributions? Why is there seems to be a very nice, refreshing resurgence pushing against anti-Semitism in the academy, specifically that God still has a future for Israel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this gets to the fall, and whether or not there's a fall or a decline or walking on a plateau. I'm not quite sure what the image is. And your observation that dispensationalism doesn't own a future for Israel, but it certainly is one of the loudest microphones for it. But I'm very aware of the work by Darrell McDermott, who will be very, very clear he's not dispensational in the least, who is very focused on a future for Israel on the basis of biblical texts. I've spent much of my career, in part, interacting with a doctoral colleague that I had, Gary Burge. Gary Burge and I overlapped 2 out of 3 years in Aberdeen. A good friend. I'm actually in a discussion group with him on Israel that still participates in this day. Very, very aware of the Palestinian-Israel situation, etc. And when he wrote his book on Israel and the land, I made the point that there were 3 key texts in Luke Acts that he ignored that all suggest that there is a future for Israel as an entity, not just for individual Jews. And those 3 texts, I call them the until texts. Behold, your house is forsaken until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Luke 13, 34, and 35, and the parallel is in Matthew 23, 37 to 39. The second is that Jerusalem is trampled until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. That's in one of the eschatological discourses in Luke chapter in Luke chapter 17, I believe. And then the third text is from Peter in Acts 3, which talks about heaven must hold the Lord until the restoration of all things, which the prophets of old discussed, which is Peter's way of saying, if you want to know what's coming, just read your Hebrew scriptures. And there's nothing in that that says that what the Hebrew scriptures have said has been altered in a way to alter the impression of what you have. And for that, the most visible text I like to point to is Isaiah 19, 23 to 25, which talks about a highway that's going to run from Egypt through Israel to Assyria. Now, you don't need to be a good student of history to know that Egypt and Assyria and Israel weren't exactly allies in the Hebrew scripture. And that there's something going on, and that each of them get a tag. Each of those nations gets a tag that show they are part of the people of God. And so, distinct tags that show they're each part of the people of God. I'll say it again. Distinct tags that show they're each part of the people of God. So you've got one people of God with many tribes and many nations that are a part of it. So you have Israel distinct as a part of the people of God from different groups of Gentiles, Jew and Gentile, one in the body of Christ, if you want to think about it that way. And yet at the same time with distinctions that represent a recall of Israel to the hope that she possesses as part of the original recipients of the promise of God. And I think the strongest element of this discussion that speaks for dispensationalism is the idea that when God makes a commitment to people, the original people to whom he addressed, he keeps that commitment to those people. That God is faithful in keeping his word. So whatever you do in expansion, whatever you do in how the Gentiles are involved, however you conceive of how Gentiles are involved with Israel, Israel as both a people and a nation, because reconciliation not only deals with individuals, it deals with all the structures of creation. That reconciliation will take place across not only individuals, but across nations. And so for that reason, Gary Birch and I have long and interesting conversations.
Thank you for that. I want to move on. James, regarding something you said in your paper, if you could make a few more comments on it. Darby seems to have been more influenced by the patristics and ancient Greek thinkers, you brought up Xenophon, than critics generally acknowledge.
Right.
For Darby and other ancients, each dispensation begins with ruin or failure. Can you give a few extra comments regarding Darby's research interest in ancient Greek sources that is commonly known?
Okay, yeah, so just, and let me just say one other prefatory word to that, and because I agree with these guys, as much as I'm interested in history, this isn't really the conversation any of us want to have. We're on the defensive. That's the point, is that it has been repeated ad nauseum that dispensationalism started in the 19th century. Well, if that's the case, I don't think any of us want anything to do with it, because we're people of the Bible, and we're not trying to follow a new innovation. The only reason it's important to make really clear a line from the earliest centuries of the church, but it doesn't do us any good if we can pin it all on somebody in the 17th or in the 16th century either, except to say that, look, throughout the history of the church, going back to the very students of the disciples, you're looking at the patristics, now you're realizing that these are the conversations they were having. Sure, there may have been 1,000 years when the Bible was largely closed up from the common man, was not being read. These topics were not being heavily discussed until the Bible begins to be read again. And so we see now, we get back to the 16th, 17th. Anyhow, so the significance of when people say, who did Darby get it from? Just because we can point to antecedents in the centuries before him, I don't think that's where he was getting it from. He certainly read French and spent a lot of time reading French theologians. He could have read Pierre Poiret, but we don't know that. Pierre Poiret's works were not in his catalog, in his personal library when it was auctioned off at the end of it, after he had passed. And when people look to Darby's writings and say, well, who does he cite? He doesn't really cite hardly anyone ever. He thinks it's not of value if it's not from Scripture alone. It's not from the Lord, no point quoting them. However, when you search his writings, the one names that will come up throughout, that everybody ignores because they're way too early, is the patristics. Just a martyr, you'll see it throughout his writings. Irenaeus, Tertullian, he comments on them all the time. He was a student reading in Greek from his elementary and college years in Greek and Hebrew, translating Luke and reading Xenophon long before his evangelical conversion. So, that was just par for the course for any student of his day with the pedigree he had. So
he was gold medal winner.
He got the gold medal in classics. I mean, he was very well.
So why do you think on that, as he did, gold medal in classics, someone called him a linguist,
Right.
German, French, Latin, perhaps Dutch and other tribal languages he would preach in. Why specifically, and going back to the patristics that you brought up, like Xenophon and others, why aren't others more attuned to that in Darby's research? There's this misconception that Darby and thinkers apprehended in the dispensational stream ignore ancient history. When you have books that are coming out like Michael Spiegel's that you comment on, Fathers of the Future, 2nd century eschatology, the 21st century church, showing these early dispensational ideas. And Darby himself was attuned to that. Why does that come up in criticisms of dispensationalism? The historical pedigree of, say, a guy like Darby getting so much of his understanding from the ancient patristics in the 2nd and 3rd century church.
Yeah, he doesn't credit them. He doesn't credit them for he cites them So it shows his familiarity with their writings, but he's not actually, giving them credit for his development of ideas. So, just shows his familiarity with them.
It's an interesting thing that generally goes unnoticed. By others. Yeah, Darrell.
Yeah, let me just piggyback on observation just made about the 2nd century, because I want to go back to the first. There is a very poor reading of Acts 1 that takes place, and it goes like this. When the disciples asked, is this the time you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? In Acts chapter 1, verse 6. The traditional Reform reading is that's a bad question. That they really missed it, and they missed what was going on. John Stott probably is famous for this. I love John Stott, but in this place, he's worthy of conversation. And so the reply that Jesus makes is not, I was with you 40 days. I opened up the Old Testament to you to tell you what the kingdom program is all about, and you guys have missed it so bad. We need to re-enroll in Eschatology 101, and I'm going to stay another 40 days and take care of this. That's not his answer. His answer is it's not for you to know the times and the seasons that are set by the Father. That's not a rejection of the premise of the question. That is an acceptance of the presence of the question, the premise of the question. And it's basically, this is a nice way to say, your business. In the meantime, I want you to do this. I want you to go out and be my witnesses in the world. So not only do we have a discussion of the future and what the future involves and what it looks like, and that question is asked by the apostles as a group, according to Acts. Not only do we have that sitting there, but we have the assignment and the prioritization of what the church is supposed to be about in the meantime. And so that combination for me has always been a lodestone in how to think about eschatology and how to think about the calling that we have as people of God, the church of God, etc. Because that premise is not rejected there. And in fact, I think the speech that Peter makes in Acts 3 that I've already alluded to that talks about, if you want to know what's coming, just read your Hebrew scriptures, is the answer to that question. We don't know the time, but we know the what. And so for me, Bob Irenaeus and Justin Martyr and Michael Steve can have them all. Okay? Okay? But I teach in New Testament, okay, and I haven't left the first century.
Very good. All right, I want to turn a corner before we open the questions up to the floor. There were 2 chapters, so as a co-editor of Discovering Dispensationalism, 2 chapters stood out to me that were my personal favorites. One was actually Mark Snoeberger's, because it's that sliver of 200 years, 1600 to 1800, Puritanism. There was actually some futurist thinkers' commentary being written, a zeal for Zionism in those early periods that you never hear of, and it was fascinating to read that primary research Mark had. The other one is Dr. Phil Long on the end, who wrote a chapter on mid-Acts dispensationalism, which oftentimes does not get a place at the table. Even here, we put you at the end of the table. I want to ask you, Phil, because that was actually a very fascinating chapter for me. It's one of my favorites in the book. A unique element, as I'm mentioning in our book, is that it features a first-hand essay on mid-Acts dispensationalism. All right? Some have pejoratively referred to that as hyper-dispensationalism, ultra-dispensationalism, these types of terms. Some have even criticized us, myself and James as the editors, for including this minority sub-tradition, dismissing it as aberrant, while others surprisingly overlooked it in their criticisms that the book, this is actually from one review that's out right now, quote, lacks development within the dispensational community, which is totally untrue. And your chapter helps demonstrate that, showing the traditions within American dispensationalism and how it's sort of branching on these different sub-traditions. So let me ask you, Phil, why is, you are a mid-Acts dispensationalist, you teach at a mid-Acts dispensational university, you publish widely in other areas, one of your books is on Enoch. Why is that mid-Acts dispensational theology is so often maligned by fellow dispensationalists? And if you can choose one major contribution that mid-Acts dispensationalism makes to our understanding of dispensational thought, what might that be?
Yeah. I guess if you're a dispensationalist, you need something to criticize, and we're there. And frequently, it's there's a addendum to Ryrie's book that's about us, and it that's where people learn about it. That's kind of the extent of it. We have not published well, unfortunately. We don't have, 33 volumes of collected work like John Nelson Darby does, so there's not a lot to work with there. I think the main contribution is going to come from my colleague and mentor, Dale DeWitt, who wrote a book on dispensationalism in America, and he was tracking with a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the hermeneutical issues and these sorts of things, but a lot of his project was to define a dispensation much more positively than test fail, test judgment failure, move on to the next dispensation. And so he has worked really hard to, what he would say, properly define a dispensation, responding to God's revelation, always focusing on, say, a righteous remnant within the dispensation. It's not, you get to the end, and I think the paper said, quoting Darby, it's utter ruin. From the beginning, it's utter ruin. And he was very interested in sort of aligning dispensationalism writ large with kind of classic Reformed, almost like Abraham Kuyper style Reformed thinking. And it's very unusual, you can come back to that. So I think his work on applying dispensationalism to kind of an overall Christian worldview and having more of a sense of engagement with culture and looking for the positive, sort of marching forward, progressing forward towards the kingdom of God. I think that's the big contribution he made.
Great. I won't ask you to explain mid-acts dispensational theology. It's in the book. You don't have to read that, but it is unique. Part of the self-promo, because I'm very proud of this work, that we have authors such as Phillip, who is a first-hand mid-acts dispensationalist alongside traditional dispensationalists like Tommy Ice, alongside progressive dispensationalists such as Darrell Bock. It makes the book very unique in that sense. There's none another like that, so I encourage you to pick it up if you haven't already. Darrell, I want to go back to your schizophrenia.
Okay.
All right. It is well known.
Chair.
We got another chair empty for your other personality.
Okay.
So it is. Now speaking, we talk about mid-acts dispensationalism. I want to talk a little bit about progressive dispensationalism, which you are a principal founder of the movement. A lot of us look at you and ask that. It is well known the pushback that you and other founders of progressive dispensationalism have received from traditionalists such as Ryrie, Walworth, Pentecost, and others, that you were advocating something that was outside the bounds of what they consider traditional or normative dispensationalism. Yet, it seems today there's hardly any pushback on progressive dispensationalism at all in wider scholarship. In fact, progressive dispensationalism hardly gets a mention in Dan Hummel's book, if at all, and seems never to receive criticism by those publishing challenges toward dispensational thought. Instead, it's virtually always more traditional forms of dispensationalism that gets critiqued or mocked, going all the way back to Darby, Schofield, or entertainment-driven medias like Left Behind books or films. But in our book, progressive dispensationalism is shown clearly to be a sub-tradition within historic dispensationalism and a legitimate development of it. After all, progressive dispensationalists, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe I'm correct, believe in a pre-trib rapture as well as a premillennial return of Christ and the future restoration of national Israel, just like the other forms do. So, Darrell, let me ask you, Dr. Bock, why do you think progressive dispensationalism gets by virtually unscathed by our scholarly critics, or does progressive dispensationalism get its share of dismissals and criticisms in academia like the more traditional forms do?
It's a good question. I think we escape criticism because people don't know what to do with us. I remember years ago at the TS meeting of the Dispensation Study Group, I gave a paper in which I was explaining how I am not Latin. And because that's what everybody labeled me as. I never read, believe it or not, even though I was in New Testament studies, I never read any George Ladd in all the writing that I did in relationship to the dispensations and stuff that I did. And the already not yet kingdom, which is why I got labeled as Laddian, actually comes out of a deeper, longer discussion in biblical studies that goes back at least to the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, coming out of European New Testament scholarship. But I didn't even find it there. I found it because I work in Luke Acts. And Luke Acts has some key passages in which it says, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, the kingdom of God has come upon you. Best I can tell, that's not a future idea. The second text is, you don't need to look for the kingdom of God here and there looking for a sign. The kingdom of God is in your midst. Okay, the best I can tell is a present text. Then there's an interesting text that doesn't mention kingdom, but it basically says the same thing in Luke 10:23 and 24, in which Jesus says to the disciples, you are experiencing what kings and prophets long to experience. And so I put those together and I go, there is something going on with the promise that's being realized, that's being said here, and that connects. And then the second part of that idea is that why should we think the kingdom program that involves our salvation is not already not yet, when our salvation is already not yet? And if you have any questions about that, I have a little set of questions I ask my students. I say, are you saved? And they'll say to me, yes. If I ask your spouse or your roommate if God is done with you yet, what will they tell me? And of course they will say, no, not done with me yet, because obviously we haven't gotten to the consummation. So our salvation experience runs in an already not yet highway. Why wouldn't the overall program that we're a part of not run down the same highway? That's the question that I was asking and pursuing. I think one of the reasons we've gotten so little criticism is, as I said, people don't know what to do with this. We're not in the traditional dispensationalist box. That's true. That's why traditional dispensationalists reacted. We were critical of them. But we're also not in the Laddian, how can I say, historic premill box either, okay? So we're this little tugboat going between those two islands that are shooting salvos at one another, and when they see the little tugboat going between the two islands, they say, oh, that's a nice little target too. We'll shoot at them as well. And so we catch it a little bit from both sides. We actually do catch some. The criticism we get from the covenantal side is, if you hang around long enough, you'll become covenantal. And I visited almost every major covenantal campus in the 1990s when we were introducing progressive dispensationalism, and that was basically the message they gave me, to which my response was, if you're actually listening what I'm saying to you hermeneutically, I will never go there all the way. Because I think the way in which Israel is addressed in the terms of promise gives Israel a place in the program of God. And then my criticism of traditional dispensationalism, this is my schizophrenia. My traditional dispensationalism is when you go to the Abrahamic covenant, because I think you have to put covenants and dispensations together. I don't think you can talk about just dispensations or just covenants. When you put them together, you have two lenses that are operating in Genesis 12, 1 to 3. And I tell people lenses cause you to focus on certain things, but because you're focused on certain things, they risk also blocking out certain things you should be looking at. That's what lenses do. The Israel lens, which is what dispensationalism focuses on, keeps its eye on what's going on with Israel. The global lens, which is what covenant theologians keep their eye on, say, if you will pay attention, there's that little thing about the seed through which all the world is going to be blessed. That's a global lens in that passage. What we were trying to do is to say, you've got to pay attention to both lenses. This is not an either or, it's a both and. And you have to ask yourself, what is the relationship between these bifocals that we're dealing with? Okay, I like pictures. So these bifocals that you're dealing with, what's being said about Israel on the one hand and what's being said about the world on the other. And I'm not going to pit those against one another because they're actually connected. And so what is that connection? And those are the questions we pursued in progressive dispensationalism. So I said I was schizophrenic. I guess I'm schizophrenic here. I got a little bit of
We would expect nothing less of
That's right. A little bit of covenant blood in me, and a little bit of, and people said that was inconsistent.
I think Dan does deal with it. In fact, I think if you said this was the crack in the foundation, if I remember, that the lordship debate was a crack, but this was a sort of foundation crack. So
before we get Dan up here to take us all to task, I have one final question for you. And James, I'm going to start with you, and all of you comment on this. Before I open up to the floor, if you have a question, just shout it out when we're done here. This will take us for the next, we have about 15 minutes before Dan Hummel comes up with his response. So, James, let me start with you, and all of you comment on this down the table. Dan's book argues, that's Dan Hummel's book, Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, argues that academic, or what he calls scholastic dispensationalism, has fallen. Yet it seems there is a resurgence in academic dispensational thought, this event right here being one demonstration. At least there's interest. So let me ask you, starting with you, James, do you agree with Dan's premise, and maybe he would push back when he gets back in his response, but before he does, let me ask you, do you agree with that overall premise that comes from rise and fall of dispensationalism? Or would you offer any pushback? And if you don't agree, in what ways do you see advancements being made for and within dispensation?
You're gonna ask the same question for each of us?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll be very quick. I think his premise is very sound in terms of a cultural evaluation, which is what he's largely looking at. He's looking at the rise, really the predominance within the culture and the way it is, dispensationalism affected a lot more than the church, and it became a cultural movement largely, and as a cultural movement, it has waned. If we're correct, and these ideas are discernible from Scripture, they'll never go away. There will always be people interested. They may be a radical, but it will be here until Christ returns.
Fair enough. Thank you. Darrell, what about you? Do you agree with the premise that scholastic dispensationalism has fallen, or would you offer any pushback? If you don't agree, what ways do you see advancements being made to dispensationalism?
I'm playing my schizophrenic card
There
again.
you go.
Okay, the answer I think is, the answer is complicated. If you look at the eschatological discussion and debate within evangelicalism, there are two conversations that are going on. They don't match each other. One is this old pull, I'm going to call it old pull, between classic reform and dispensation, where there's this tug of war, which I think to some degree Dan's book fits into that slot. If you look and say into the ETS, where there was a discussion about, if you'll notice, there not only is progressive dispensations, there's also a thing called progressive covenantalism. Yes. That's interesting. Okay, that was a reaction to us, and they tried to form a group like we did at the dispensational group of covenantalism. And when they were forming it, I said, I don't think your group's going to last very long because you all are so creedal, you're not going to get past your creeds. And it only lasted 3 years. Ours ran for more than 20. And but there's also a change in the discussion between covenantalists and dispensationalists that's pretty important. I mean, if you put Walbert and Ladd in the same room, you would hire people to be sure that they both walked out alive. Okay, you put many of us in the same room with covenantalists. We're having discussions on which there are certain things that we share about the mission of the church, and there are certain things that we have discussions about. And the tone of that conversation is very, very different than it was. That's actually pretty important in my view. I had ongoing conversations for years through email with Daniel Fuller about, I was actually explaining why I wasn't Laddian. And I said to him, the reason I'm not Laddian is I think Israel as a role, as a national entity in the plan of God, has a future. And I think Ladd was very vague, and I would criticize him there. And he said to me, 2 sentences, you're right, and you're right. And so that's the kind of thing. So is that a rise or fall? That's why I used the term plateau earlier. You've got 2 different conversations happening within evangelicalism about how to view dispensationalism. And they both have some merit, they both have some value, they both are worth having. Okay? And then the last thing I've got to say, I've got to talk about this crack, or else I'll be cracked and schizophrenic. And that is, it isn't a crack in dispensationalism that is present. It's a crack in traditional dispensationalism that is being surfaced. And it is a push on these very texts that I've just mentioned, which I deeply believe suggest there is this already not yet structure in Scripture, which, if dispensationalism would embrace, would give it a more holistic and a more unified way of reading the Scripture. Because my own reaction to dispensation when I was growing up was, any movement that wants to sidebar the Sermon on the Mount in the way that traditional dispensationalism did, to me has a problem with the way in which the ethics of the Bible gets put together. And one of the most important things that the Bible does for us is tell us how to live.
All right, man, that can open up a whole other conversation to be able to delve into, but we don't have the time. Quickly, moving forward. Mark, is Dan right? Is scholastic dispensationalism has it fallen?
Fallen, perhaps it's a little too strong, but certainly we're in massive decline. And I think, yeah, the numbers there bear it out. You said, what, 50 to 60% of ETS attendees back in the 50s and 60s were dispensationalists. I don't know what the percentage is now, but it's much less than that. There's no doubt that we are losing market share in the academic conversation. I don't think we can argue that. What I was most interested in was the reasons for it, and I think you tagged three that sort of concentrated around the 80s and 90s: the Left Behind series, the Lordship debate, and the rise of progressive dispensationalism. Each one of which, for good or ill, did fragment and polarize them. And I think that you're right on that.
All right, Bill.
I wouldn't say fallen, I might say driven underground. Since the Left Behind explosion, I have noticed that books are being published that I would go, yeah, that's dispensational, but the word isn't used. And to use Darrell Bock, he's edited several volumes for Appraisal with Chosen People Ministries, and I reviewed those books and I read through them, and I know those people are dispensationalists, but they don't use the word. Because if you say dispensationalist, it categorizes you into this pigeonhole, and nobody wants to be there. So it seems to me that the work is still going on, but it's not going on waving the flag and saying the name.
Very good. I appreciate you guys. We have time for one question. Yes, I know you got to, but they can grab everybody on their way, trying to run back to ETS. But is there anybody that has a question that's just burning on the brain, that have to get up, stand up, be moved by the Spirit, just throw it out and see how it goes? If not, we're going to move to Dan. Yes, sir.
I'll go for it.
Go ahead.
All right, here we go. Why is dispensationalism a better response than what we see going on with personal and Christian nationalism? How about that?
Let me repeat that. So why is dispensationalism a better response? I already like the way you framed that. Thank you. Why is dispensationalism a better response to postmillennialism and Christian nationalism?
Yes.
A couple thoughts. What do you guys think? Anyway.
Because we're not naturalizing the end of time. We can't bring it about ourselves. Only Christ is going to be able to come and do that for us. So apart from the arrival of Jesus Christ to set things straight, we're not going to find the nation or the world healing itself.
I think that dispensationalism, properly understood, is ecclesiological. It defines the church properly, and kind of as a secondary aspect, has some eschatological answers. So I think it's a better answer for defining church and how church works in the present age.
Dispensationalism is able to present both the unity and diversity of what the kingdom of God is going to be. And that diversity does not privilege any particular nation in that picture.
Well, I would also say that it is absolutely a very optimistic view of the end times. Obviously, it gets a bad rap because it's pessimistic. It's pessimism. It has to do with man's ability to bring about. Yes, dispensationalism looks at Scripture and understands the pattern that man has never been capable in and of himself to achieve God's end. God alone can achieve God's end. He sent his Son to do that. He will send his Son once more to do it again.
Now, please give a round of applause for our. Okay, we're going to transition to our critical respondent. Let me introduce Dr. Dan Hummel, who is the director of Lumen Center in Madison, Wisconsin, and a research fellow in the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dan is the author of The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. I know the subtitle of your book, there it is right there. Published in 2023. as well as Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and the U.S.-Israeli Relations, 2019. Dan has published articles on religion, politics, and foreign policy in the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and Religious News Service, and is a frequent contributor to religion and American culture and church history. Most recently, he was featured on PBS. Very fascinating interview, if any of you caught that. Dr. Hummel is also the author of Eternal Life Now, subtitled The Persistence, Promise, and Peril of Modern Evangelical Spirituality, forthcoming by Erdman's. And I will just say, I know Dan personally. We enjoyed almost 2 hours of a coffee this morning, plus some other conversations that him and I have had, and he's just been a wonderful conversational partner, and always wanted to be able to contribute to this particular discussion. When I asked Dan if he would be willing to be a critical respondent to this session, he said yes and amen right away, which we appreciated that he was here. So if you would please welcome Dr. Dan Hummel.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I just want to first thank Cory for the invitation. Thank you, James, for the honor of responding to your paper. Thank you for the comments for everybody on the panel about my book and about this topic, which I find endlessly fascinating. Even though, if it's not apparent, I do come out of the dispensational tradition, I am not currently a dispensationalist. But I think these types of conversations are just a privilege to talk across difference. I think one difference that's obvious is I don't count myself a dispensationalist. I think another difference that'll become obvious as I talk, and I hope my comments are relevant, even though they were sort of framed around James's paper, is that there's also a disciplinary and methodological difference in how we even come to some of these questions about history and about particularly influence, which to me is the key word in the title of this paper, Darby's Influence. So I have limited time. I want to hit 3 points. So the first 2 are short. First, I want to affirm part of James' premise. Second, I want to briefly indicate the provenance of this particular debate over Darby's influence. And then I want to make my, I guess you could say, critical remark, which is a call for current and future participants in this and similar historical debates to incorporate methods from the field of intellectual history. I'll focus on a simple method of comparative history for our time here. I know this may sound self-serving. I am an intellectual historian, but hopefully the usefulness of this approach will come through based on the merits of what I'm saying. So first point is to affirm the premise of James's work that for a long time there has been a systematic bias to the study of dispensationalism that has created too simplistic a line of influence from Darby to modern dispensationalism. As a qualification, I don't think that acknowledging this necessarily means we ditch the centrality of Darby, but we do think about his influence in a more complex way. And here I just want to cite someone that I have cited numerous times. Her name is Susan Harding. She's an anthropologist. She's not a Christian as far as I understand. But back in the 90s, she talked about fundamentalism, so a slightly different topic than dispensationalism, but I think this quote applies. She talked about fundamentalism as the, quote, internally orientalized other for academic study of religion. Fundamentalists were othered or internally orientalized, which meant they were stigmatized, cast out of public life, according to academics, marked as a category of inferior persons whose very existence required explanation. What does it mean to be orientalized? If you don't remember your Edward Said, this was a term that Edward Said, a theorist, used to talk about the way Western people looked at the Orient. What was Susan Harding trying to get at when she called fundamentalists, or in this case I'm saying dispensationalists, the orientalized other of academic study? It means that academics have tended to look at dispensationalism as a static tradition with no change over time. They've often been reductionistic about defining it. We've talked here about the end times focus. And they often commit the genetic fallacy, assuming that because there's questionable origins to something, that makes the entire thing questionable. So I want to stand with James and Susan Harding in lamenting how many, though not all, academic approaches to this question of Darby and his influence on dispensationalism have assumed dispensationalism to be less than or inferior than other traditions of thought. My second point is to highlight the long-running debate around this particular narrow topic of Darby's influence. Close to 30 years ago, David McLeod, is he in the room, by the way? Any chance? Published a lengthy article in Bibliotheca Sacra titled Walter Scott, A Link in Dispensationalism Between Darby and Schofield, ? And this was his conclusion. He says, Scott is the direct link between Schofield and Darby. I'm not going to get into who Scott is, but he's someone who was important in the late 19th century Brethren world. Therefore, it would be disingenuous for anyone to assert that Schofield's views cannot be connected with the works and influence of Darby and the Brethren. Those who have made such assertions in the past have inadvertently overlooked the evidence that supplies such a direct link. That evidence is the testimony of C.I. Schofield himself, who expressed his thanks to Mr. Walter Scott, the eminent biblical scholar, in the Schofield Reference Bible preface. So MacLeod draws a different conclusion from James, but I don't think either has the last word. MacLeod was entering a very old debate even in the 90s. As James mentions, Ryrie was weighing in on this in 1965. Ryrie was responding to criticisms of Darby linked to modern dispensationalism, advanced most publicly by Oswald T. Allis in the 1940s, who was responding to claims by Louis Berry Schaeffer in the 1930s. Schaeffer was locked into a battle that dates at least to the 1890s between post-tribulational and pre-tribulational premillennialists that basically ripped apart the famed Niagara Bible Conference in the late 1890s. So this debate, in short, has been around for a while, and it's really just a subtopic of a wider debate over the historicity or the historical legacy of dispensationalism. So what do we make of this long, almost seemingly unmovable debate that we're continuing to talk about? And here's where I want to move to my third and longest point, which is to my knowledge, and James, maybe I don't know exactly what you were trained in, but to my knowledge, everyone else, at least before James, was not an intellectual historian coming at this debate. And trust me, I don't think adding an intellectual historian into every historical subject improves the quality of the conversation, but sometimes, especially when the question is about intellectual influence, such a person can provide some help. Lord knows, trained historians have been part of the problem as much as the solution, as James even indicates. But here I want to talk about more of the method of intellectual history and convey that to you. And humbly, I would suggest an intellectual history approach helps us establish Darby's, you could say, direct and indirect influence on later dispensationalism. To put it succinctly, what I'm arguing is that the way forward on this particular question, Darby's influence on later dispensationalism, is to decouple the historical and apologetical stakes of this argument through the methods of intellectual history. By apologetical, I mean the way history impinges upon the supposed legitimacy of dispensationalism as a theology. Stating dispensationalism's relative recency or ties to Darby can be, and has been, as we all know, construed as a form of criticism meant to undermine the credibility of dispensationalism as a conservative, orthodox Christian theological tradition. In secular academic settings, the orientalization of dispensationalism has dismissed it as an intellectual theological tradition worthy of study. One that develops, responds to critiques, has centers of training. These are all things that are largely absent from the academic discussion of dispensationalism. All that said, I think an intellectual history method can establish causal explanations of influence, which do not necessarily have apologetical implications, at least necessary apologetical implications. Before moving to the specific comparative method I want to clarify what intellectual history is. In the field, we make a distinction between a history of ideas approach and an intellectual history approach to ideas. The history of ideas approach, to borrow one academic definition, looks at large-scale concepts as they appear and transform over the course of history, and tends to organize the historical narrative around one major idea, and will then follow the development or metamorphosis of that idea as it manifests itself in different contexts and times. I take Discovering Dispensationalism to be one example of a history of ideas approach. The strength of this approach is that it permits us to recognize commonalities in thought despite vast similarities in context. While the history of ideas approach has been popular in the past and among non-academic historians, it is not the primary method of intellectual historians. The history of idea approach tends to regard ideas, as one of their theorists call it, as units, not unlike atoms, that move through time to be picked up and used by different human thinkers. This idealistic understanding of how ideas work is essentially Platonic and takes little account of context, institutions, human personality, material conditions, reception history, and so forth. While it continues to be a popular mode in general audience histories of, say, human rights, intellectual historians tend to see these as mostly convenient, usable tasks written by partisans for the topic under examination, such as human rights. As an intellectual historian, I methodologically want to move past the history of ideas approach and understand the ways ideas work in history, church history as much as any other history. I tend to focus on the interaction of ideas, institutions, and individuals, Others have different ways they take stock of this idea that historians always talk about context. A more sophisticated definition of intellectual history, as offered by Peter Gordon, a leading intellectual historian, is that intellectual history, as opposed to the history of ideas, resists the Platonist expectation that an idea can be defined in the absence of the world. And it tends instead to regard ideas as historically conditioned features of the world, which are best understood with some larger context, whether it's the context of social struggle or institutional change, intellectual biography, or some other large context of cultural or linguistic dispositions. This distinction between the two types of history relates specifically to how we frame the question of Darby's influence. In one sense, the difference in whether dispensationalism dates to Darby or some other previous era comes down to this methodological question. The term dispensational thought, as I understand it used by the Discovering Dispensationalism volume, denotes a looser sense of concepts that are transmitted over broad swaths of time. It's a history of ideas approach. Many of the historical actors in their volume ascribe to one aspect of dispensational thought, but say aren't Protestant or preacher of rapture or biblical inerrantist, and that is okay for the volume. But the term dispensationalism, as I used it in my book, and as James quotes me as using it, refers to a set of doctrines, teachings, and interpretations that have cohered into a tighter system of theology since the 19th century. It is an intellectual history approach to the problem of dispensationalism. I should say this distinction between definitions is familiar to dispensationalists themselves, as articulated by dispensational scholar Michael Bock. At the beginning of one of his books, he says, "Many of the beliefs of dispensationalism reach deeply into church history, but the system of theology known as dispensationalism began in the mid-19th century. My quibble with terms like dispensational thought or beliefs of dispensationalism is that partial resemblances of theological ideas over time does not necessarily amount to a tradition of thought." This distinction affects how I define the term influence as well, the key word in the paper. When evaluating the relationship of Darby to later dispensationalist thinkers, it's important to clarify what we mean by the word influence. Do we mean specific doctrines or schemes, reading methods, a sort of canon within the canon of Scripture, specific institutional influences or networks, personal influence? These are all at play when talking about influence. As an intellectual historian, my interest in influence, as James's title has it, is broader than direct transmission of specific schemes. And in fact, too close attention on those specifics can distract from a fuller assessment of influence. As you might be gleaning, in the intellectual history method, as I just described it, the idea of influence is more capacious, but also, I would argue, more precise. Intellectual history more precisely defines when, in history, an idea or set of ideas emerges as a coherent whole, as historically significant, and more precisely how those ideas came to be formed and have sway among people more than the person who thought up the idea. Using an intellectual history approach changes how we would think about Darby's influence on Schofield. The method I want to suggest is particularly useful here for this question is comparison or comparative intellectual history. I'm going to do a very rote, simple version of it here. Comparison does a few things for dispensationalism. One of them is it allows us to distill the history of dispensationalism into an unexceptional history, and this is a good thing if you don't want to be orientalized by the academic guild. It's a history that's not unique or requires special explanation outside of things that happen to all other ideas and intellectual theological traditions held and debated by human beings. Now in this case, comparison means I'm going to make a comparison here between Darby and another mid-19th century thinker. James has mentioned how dispensationalists bristle at Darby being compared to Joseph Smith or Charles Taze Russell as a sort of ad hominem fallacy. So I'm quaking in my shoes at the moment because I'm going to suggest someone even further beyond the pale than those people, which is Karl Marx. But if you give me a minute. We have Karl Marx. He lived from 1818 to 1883. And we have Marxism, an intellectual tradition that has far outlasted him, but is undoubtedly indebted to his writings and his ideas. I think we should enter into talking about dispensationalism as intellectual historians do about Marxism. In Marxism, there are some core doctrines, you could say, that are propounded by Marx in his writings, including materialism, class struggle, revolutionary progress of history, and more. None of these concepts are Marx's invention alone. Communism does not equal Marxism. These ideas all have much longer histories, many going back to ancient Greek political philosophy or interpretations of the Bible, though often used by Marx in ways different because of the systematized view of the world he was building. Not only that, the people who came after Marx refined his ideas, emphasized different things, and applied them in ways that they, whom we would call Marxists, did their own things with. And some later Marxists even rejected key doctrines that Marx himself propounded. Marx believed class struggle, to be successful, had to disregard national boundaries. Most Marxist revolutionaries, from Lenin to Mao to Castro, dropped that doctrine. Marx's influence on Lenin should not be questioned because Lenin launched his communist revolution as part of a nationalist revolt in Russia. It's just more complicated. Otherwise, if we define Marxism as those who believe exactly what Marx taught, then I think Marxism was a party of one, Karl Marx. It's not really a helpful definition historically speaking, though I acknowledge that it may be a good philosophical definition for a philosophical inquiry of what Marx thought. Here's where I think asking about the relationship of Darby to dispensationalism is instructive. As I and other academic historians argue, Darby's influence was not limited or even chiefly in conveying a specific dispensational stage scheme to later dispensationalists. It was broader than that intellectually and institutionally, as is evident when we come to the sources from an intellectual history perspective. If we, to borrow the definition, see Schofield's ideas as historically conditioned features of the world which are best understood within some larger context, then facts that might be new to people here, I'm sure James knows many of these facts, but these are facts about Schofield that would move to the forefront of the inquiry about influence. That would convince me, at least, that Schofield and the Schofield Reference Bible were a product of Darby's influence in a meaningful sense of that phrase. First, we know, based on the good research of historians dating back to Ernest Sandin in the 1960s, that Schofield's original mentor in the Christian faith, James Oakes of St. Louis, was a reader and promoter of Brethren teachings. We know that the person most responsible for the Schofield Reference Bible's notes on prophecy was Arno C. Gaebelin, a one-time Brethren, and someone who stated the Brethren had done more to shape his faith than any other group. We know, based on Gabelin's recollections, that a key text that Schofield modeled his notes on was written by the most important Brethren thinker in North America at the time, Frederick Grant. Grant's 7-volume numerical Bible, published in the 1890s, was kept at Schofield's desk throughout his work on his reference Bible. And by the way, I don't really want to stake too much on this, but Grant has a 7-stage dispensational scheme that, as far as I can tell, uses the exact same terms as Schofield, and seems to me to be just as likely a major influence on Schofield as anyone else we've talked about. I suspect one reason why Schofield thanked Walter Scott and not Frederick Grant in the preface to the reference Bible is that Scott was still alive in 1909 and Grant had died in 1902, but that's just a speculation on my part. We also know that Schofield's funding to research his reference Bible was offered up by Plymouth Brethren businessmen in New York City. And finally, we know that Henry Froude, the publisher at Oxford University Press of the Bible, was also a Plymouth Brethren. So aside from these contextual factors, we also know that Schofield wasn't the only game in town in terms of conveying Brethren ideas to American evangelicals at the time. While important, the Schofield Reference Bible was just one cultural artifact. William Blackstone's Jesus is Coming, published in 1878, was the first dispensationalist bestseller, you could say. Blackstone was not shy about his indebtedness to the Brethren, even as he also critiqued some of their views. There are other 19th century vectors, not as closely related to Schofield, but all who trace back to the Brethren. James mentioned the possible influence of the Baptist James Robinson Graves. Where did Graves get his ideas? He adopted his historic premillennialism before the Civil War, but afterward he started reading the writings of Brethren, mediated through other Americans like the Lutheran Joseph Seiss and the Baptist James Inglis, both themselves followers of Brethren writings. So Graves became a pre-tribulationist in response, so any influence that Graves had on Schofield would also be attributable to indirect influence that the Brethren had, and by extension Darby, on Graves. In all this then, I find myself agreeing with the particular point James's paper is making, while disagreeing with the implications that I think are being drawn from the overall thesis. To state again, I agree that Schofield did not take his dispensational stage scheme directly from Darby. The differences are real and point to a complicated relationship between Darby and later dispensationalist thought. But that is only one narrow definition of influence, based, if I might be honest, on too much of a history ideas of approach for my taste of how ideas are transmitted and absorbed. And while I can respect the differences in approaches, I just think a history of ideas approach that Jane models and Discovering Dispensationalism also employs is intellectually unsatisfying. And maybe this is just a personal taste thing, more than a methodological thing. I'm going to go back to Marx one more time. So to invoke the Marxist example again, When a modern liberation theologian claims class struggle is a doctrine not found in Marxist thought originally, but in the Bible, how do most of us instinctually evaluate that claim? Of course, care for the poor, selling possessions for the life of the church, and so forth are in the Bible, taught by church fathers. But that doesn't mean liberation theology, in the concepts, hermeneutics, and application of those ideas, isn't also deeply influenced by Marxist thought. I think that same dynamic is at play in dispensationalism, at least on a limited scale. Dispensationalists do have ground to stand on, that many of their ideas are much older than the 19th century. But anyone called or calling themselves a dispensationalist has lived in the wake of the movement Darby and the Brethren created. And historically speaking, the vast majority of dispensational leaders from 1850 to 1900 lived and operated around key Plymouth Brethren leaders and speakers. As a historical point, this seems to me to be undisputable. And so I come to arguments about influence that ignore this fact a bit skeptically, even as I understand apologetically where the impulse comes from to minimize the influence of Darby and the Brethren. And that's where I want to leave my remarks. Not that anyone is asking in this room, but what I would like to see is a dispensationalist historian work through the material using intellectual history methods and bracketing the apologetical concerns of what the history implies for the legitimacy of dispensationalism. And I'm really open. Maybe there is an alternate version of 19th century history that we've yet to write or uncover. Maybe the force of Isaac Watts's writings on this topic is the actual thing that unifies all late 19th century American premillennialists more than Darby and the Brethren, and then better explains the shape of 20th century history. Again, I'm skeptical, but the joy of modern history is that the terrain is vast, and that means historians have not explored all of it, and good historians are open to new sources and new arguments. And in this, I want to know the history as best as humanly possible, regardless of its theological implications. All truth is God truth. I think we all agree with that here. And my hope is that the conversation around this issue of history can continue, though, at the level of historical methods, mine or others, to further refine our knowledge of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, very much for that response. We wanted to be able to end on Dan's critical response to the paper, as well as the comments from the panel, in an act of charity and appreciation and gratitude for you being here. Thank you so much. It is an interesting note to end on, the different approaches of a history of ideas versus an intellectual history, and that gives me food for thought moving forward. If anything comes out of this discussion, I hope it's obvious that there is interest in dispensationalism and the current trends of dispensationalism, both from critics but also within dispensationalism itself. And if this session is any marker for what is to come, I think the future is brighter than what is often painted in the dismal decline, if you will, of dispensationalism. There's resurgence of this interest seems to suggest the opposite. So we're going to end now. Just so you guys know, ETS, the next session started at 3 o'clock. We have some panelists that are going to be speaking over there that have to get out of here, but you might be able to flag one of them down for questions if you have for them. We do have some books at the back of the table there for $21. If not here, you got them in the exhibit hall there, and we're going to call it there. Tom, did you have something to say?
I'm told there are some extra box lunches, so you're free.
Oh, thank you, yeah. There's some extra box lunches for you guys. If you didn't grab one on the way in, grab it on the way out, and we thank you so much for attending the session. Blessings.